All right. Looks like we're good to
Okay, we are live. Yes, sorry. Here I am. It is the Prospect Weekly Roundup, your source every week. Yeah, tune in 1 hour. You get everything. You don't really need to pay attention to anything until 12:30 Eastern Fridays. I am David Dayen, the executive editor. With me today, writing fellow Luke Goldstein. How you doing, Luke?
Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's good to be on the left Joe Rogan show. That's what we're calling
This
this now?
we're The left is
You're making
looking
a bid?
for their own Joe Rogan, and we've been here all along.
I thought this was
That's
it. Yeah.
that's the left's Joe Rogan. He's we're gonna do 3 hours really intense
Right.
stuff with you right now.
The alien
Um,
stuff is gonna come at the end. Yeah.
yeah, if you're trying to prioritize, like if you're big into aliens,
That's your
just
thing.
just tune back later. All right. Well, we're not going to do aliens today, but we are going to do kind of an alien sentiment, which is Democrats learning. So we just posted this piece from Luke that I want to talk about. It's called "The Changing of the Guard." It's over at prospect.org right now, and it's about an interesting trend that we're starting to see, and it's picking up specifically in this kind of inside baseball set of battles for the ranking membership of various House committees. So why don't you walk us through that and tell us what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, so, it sounds kind of wonky, but these ranking member positions, they hold a lot of sway for determining each party's legislative agenda for the next 2 years. And once you get locked into these spots, there's an incumbency effect, right? So you very well may hold on to them for a while. So when there's an
Right.
opening like this, for there to be some change at the top, for the top level positions on these committees, it is pretty important. I think the
And,
backdrop
and
here,
just to be clear here, I mean,
yeah,
sometimes there are openings because a committee member leaves.
right.
There's somebody is retires or is termed out or just goes away. This is a special case because usually uh, on the Democratic side, committee assignments are based on seniority. So if you are the individual who has the most seniority on a committee, you are likely to become the ranking Democrat, either the chair if the Democrats are in the majority, or the ranking member if they're in the minority. That's what's interesting about this moment, right? Is that we have people in place who aren't leaving Congress, uh, who are being challenged. And this is somewhat rare. I mean, there are
Right.
examples of it in the past, but it's somewhat rare.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And there's always kind of like a jockeying for position of getting the blessing of, the top leadership to run or launch one of these challenges. I think the kind of more general backdrop here is, it's not really a big surprise, but Democrats have, among other things, somewhat of a problem with being perceived as this kind of gerontocracy over the past 4 years.
Right.
And there's obviously a lot of kind of good reason for that, and there are lots of different factions
Namely,
fighting right
such
now.
as
Namely,
why is there good reason for that?
right. Well, namely, the oldest president in modern history, who had to step aside in the middle of the race. And there are all kinds of factions right now, but maybe the one, kind of maybe the most important schism here is, the kind of generational leadership battle that's playing out on a lot of different fronts, but these ranking member positions being the main one. So I think the kind of, top line race here is for the Judiciary Committee spot.
Just
Um,
I want to actually go back on that for a second
yeah,
because this could be dismissed as, oh, it's just old people being replaced by new people, and what's the real difference here? It's just somebody's age, but it's really more than that. You know, People in Congress now who are in their 40s or in their 30s maybe came up in an era of establishment failure. right? I mean, if you're going back to 9/11, the failure of the intelligence community, the financial crisis and the failure of financial regulation, the Iraq war and the failure of intelligence there, all the way on up, there has been a lack of accountability and there has been a loss of faith in institutions. And if you are part of a younger generation, you actually feel that very specifically in a way that an
Right.
old lion of the house who's been there for 17 terms like Gerald Nadler doesn't feel right. And we saw this in the campaign where a major kind of outgrowth of it was we have to protect our democratic institutions. Well, what if our democratic institutions aren't really worth protecting? What if they aren't if the public doesn't believe that there's anything there that's worthy of preservation? And so I think, it's not just younger members of Congress coming up and they're going to, promote the same policies or everything. It's about a mindset, isn't it?
Yeah, no, certainly. And when I mean generational, I guess I don't mean just in the conventional sense, but some of these races that we'll talk about, there is an ideological inflection to the contest for the ranking member as well. But I mean, in a general sense, like the problem has gotten so bad for Democrats that one of the ranking members here who is trying to hold on to his spot, like has not actually been able to completely fulfill the obligations of a
Right.
demanding position. This is David Scott on the Agriculture Committee. So, I
He's
mean, there's a
from
whole host
Georgia.
of
He's a
ways.
Democrat.
Yeah.
He's 79 years old. One time I was
Yeah.
in the House, one of the House office buildings, and he could barely walk. I don't understand how he's still the ranking Democrat on a committee.
Yeah. I mean, it is like a very basic governance, a challenge is really my point here. Like, I also just think there is, in some sense, just a perception too of, among the public of Democrats being out of touch, and that's what we, kind of saw in the election. And
Mm-hmm.
it just is a bad look when people have to defend very elderly members that they're totally fit and able to serve, like we had with Dianne Feinstein, and then they, die,
Right.
in office. So this has just been a
Or
recurring
Biden.
challenge.
Or Biden. I mean,
Yeah.
it gives the impression that uh, Democrats are covering up, they're hiding the truth, and that infects so much more than just the one individual who you're covering for. It gives an impression of the party more generally and its leadership.
Right. And again, I mean, I do chart this out briefly in the piece, but since we're going down this road, it's like there was a whole line of decision making that not
Yeah,
just led not just to, Biden being in that spot and then having to drop out, but to him being the president in the first place. I mean, like Jim Clyburn was a key power broker in the 2020 primaries. He's now 84 years old. Nancy
right.
Pelosi was the one who finally had to tell Biden to, kind of hand over the keys, right? And, she's 84 as well. Now, they've both stepped down from some of their, highest ranking positions in the party, but they're the behind the scenes actors here. They're still
Yeah,
calm.
they're still hanging out. I
Yeah,
mean, have we had this kind of a moment where the leadership of a party leaves, but then sticks around and therefore has this kind of I don't even know how to describe it, like an extraterritorial shadow kind of
right,
leadership set of positions that overshadows the new leadership that's coming in. I bet you 1 in 10 Democrats probably couldn't even name beyond Hakeem Jeffries. They couldn't name
right.
Pete Aguiar and Catherine Clark, who are the number. Well, I reversed it. Clark's number 2 and Aguiar's number 3 in the House Democratic leadership. It's just very strange that that's clinging to power. Even when you give it up, you haven't really given it up.
Right. Yeah, I mean, no, it is. I think the word you used is right. There is this kind of shadow behind the scenes, leadership. And also, I said this a little bit up front, but in some of these contests for the ranking member positions, we don't have a clash like this as out in the open that often. But there is still an element that they're asking for the blessing of Nancy Pelosi behind the scenes before they
Right.
officially launch, this kind of challenge for
Right.
the
Of
great
like a
Virginia.
random
And
backbencher
yeah,
Democrat from California. I mean, it's just a
right,
very odd situation. And it perpetuates this feeling of gerontocracy because Pete Aguiar and Catherine Clark aren't going on MSNBC, but Pelosi and Clyburn sure are.
right.
And it just perpetuates that the public face of this party is a bunch of old people.
Yeah,
And yeah,
yeah. I mean, you just uh, you want a public face of people who look like they should be serving in public office, not, in like an old folks home. And I mean that with no disrespect because I just visited my grandma over the holidays who's in an elderly care facility, but she's not running for the chair of the agriculture committee.
right,
She thinks
right,
she
right, right.
could, but we had to
I,
walk her
I
down.
think, I think she'd be all right.
Yeah.
What's her view on the farm bill? Anyway, so yeah, you highlight a bunch of different committees. Now, one we've already got the decision made. So Jamie Raskin is going to take over the House
Right.
Judiciary Committee in favor of Gerald Nadler, who's been there for over 30 years in Congress. Um, but that leaves an opening because Raskin was already a committee top, was in the leadership of the Democratic Party in the committee, in the Oversight Committee. And we're going to see a very interesting race there, right?
Yeah. So uh it looks well, sorry, as of today now it's official. So AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is going to make a run for that ranking
Mm-hmm.
member position on oversight to take over from Raskin. I mean, oversight has a bunch of different powers, but it really is it's a public facing role. You're doing, a lot of investigate or public hearings
Right.
and such. A lot of
And
members
if
have kind
and
of made their
in
name
two
there.
year and in 2 years, if Democrats take back the House, it's going to be probably the primary place where you see pushback against the Trump administration. That certainly was the case. Henry Waxman was the
Yeah.
longtime chair of the Oversight Committee, and during the Bush years, he was very, very prominent in terms of oversight on Bush administration activities. So it's a big role. And so you have AOC on one side, and she's actually the vice chair right now
Right.
of the committee. This actually started kind of way back when because Raskin kind of jumped the line over Carolyn Maloney and got that position among others. But so AOC is the vice chair right now, but Jerry Connolly, who tried to become chair or not chair but ranking Democrat
Yeah.
on the oversight committee, he tried for that and lost to Raskin. Now he's going to try again. He's been on that committee for much longer than AOC has.
Yeah, and he represents, a suburban, pretty, well-off, affluent district of Northern Virginia. Yeah, it's like a big hub for defense contractors and such. You know, I mean, I think with them, it's also there's some, there's an ideological contest, but they just represent different, parts of the party. They have different constituencies. They've kind of, cared about different issues in their terms in Congress. One flashpoint I mention is that in 2018, Amazon had this whole kind of like parade around the country for their second headquarters, where they asked every city basically to roll out the red carpet to see how
Right.
high of a tax subsidy deal they could get. That was more or less the bottom line. And they had initially selected Queens, New York for that headquarters. And AOC was just getting in office, and she kind of made a big deal of that. She thought the public dollars should not be going to this giant company when there are all these studies that show that the subsidies don't really pan out all that well for local areas,
Right.
just in terms of the jobs they bring. So Amazon then pulled out of that selection. They went to Northern Virginia. They're in Arlington, which is just in the back door of Connolly's district. And I think he was more forthcoming. It just represents different styles, I think, of of
Yeah,
politics here that would be relevant
yeah.
for the oversight committee.
I believe what happened on HQ2 is that Amazon actually picked both of those places at the
Right,
same time.
right,
And
right.
when they pulled out of Queens, they moved more resources into Arlington.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, so and then the one you really focus on in the piece is this agriculture committee, and we already talked about David Scott, who,
Yeah.
unlike Nadler, who willingly stepped down, Scott is hanging in there. He is not going gently into that good night. And there are
Yeah.
two opponents, and whether or not Scott stays in the race probably might determine what the outcome is going to be. So who are the other contenders for that position?
Yeah, no, I mean, Scott's not going away, and it's going to be a tough fight. And him staying in this contest is going to, influence the vote for gets the ranking member spot potentially. So, it is pretty significant. The Congressional Black Caucus is not endorsing his bid. He's a Georgia Scott's a Georgia congressman, that is. So
Mm-hmm.
that's significant, but there's no movement so far. So the two people who've thrown their hat into the ring are Jim Costa, who's a California congressman. He's been on the committee for a number of years. He's on the older side. He's in his 70s too.
Yeah,
And then you have Angie Craig, who is going to challenge him for that spot. She's much younger, Minnesota Congress member. And I mean, basically, she's running on kind of representing a new generation of leadership in the party. Um,
yeah,
but she doesn't have as fleshed out of a record here on ag issues, and I will say in fairness that when it comes to Democrats and ag, like it might not be the worst thing because it gives some room for changing the direction of the party's policy on farm and rural issues, which I think if we're being honest, like it's just not working out that well. The reason to focus on this ag committee spot is there are a lot of different electoral reasons for why Democrats just underperformed and just got eviscerated in November. But a big one is that they just have never been able to make up ground in rural parts of the country, non-urban, suburban areas. And it feels like every election year, Democrats think, well, it can't get any worse for our numbers in rural parts of the country. And it just somehow does. I think Trump had
yeah,
a unique ability to do this, to just find votes that no one thought he could. And outside city areas and in the swing states, but he did. So I really do think Democrats have to rethink what their strategy is here. And the ranking member position is important. Jim Costa, yeah. Uh, well, so Jim Costa, I think just really kind of represents the party's sort of status quo on ag issues. The fight I write about in this piece that I think was pretty defining for his legacy here is during the Obama administration, um, the USDA, Department of Agriculture, decided that they were going to actually get really pretty serious about a host of bad corporate practices that were hurting farmers in particular and other players, in the ag industry, smaller players who are going up against the big meat packers. And they initiated a set of new rules to adapt the Packers and Stockyards Act, which is the landmark antitrust law for agriculture, kind of defends against, anti-competitive practices, general kind of predation by the large meat packers. We've had it on the books for over 100 years, had a bunch of loopholes just as the industry has developed. So they wanted to close up those loopholes in the law. And um, basically, the ag industry completely freaks out. They don't want the government to have more enforcement powers against these contracts that they rig against smaller farmers to pay them less and generally retaliate against them during the contract negotiations. So the meatpacker industry and agribusiness writ large turns to Congress and they go to the Agriculture Committee and they really, they lobby members to put the pressure on the administration to kill these rules. And the House is controlled by Republicans at the time. But Costa was a key Democrat that went along with the House Republicans to, just basically harass the USDA. There's a specific division called GIPSA that oversees the Packards and Stockyards Act enforcement. And, they call them before hearings. They, admonish them for these rules. They sent all these basically like cease and desist letters. Costa signed on to, all of those, and he played a really key role. And eventually,
Yeah.
getting Tom Vilsack to call off the GIPSA rules, which would have been, landmark updates to the law.
Yeah. So, while a lot of these races have kind of an old guard, new guard context, this one potentially also has some ideological importance. As you say, once the if the Congress turns over and Democrats win back
Right.
the House, these people will be chairs in all likelihood and able to set agendas, and then if there's ever a trifecta in the future of the Democratic Party, they'll be able to make policy. So there are a lot of reasons why this is an important, even if it's under the radar fight. And it does show to an extent that Democrats are learning a little bit, at least in the sense
Yeah.
of maybe our public face shouldn't be 85 years old and unable to string a sentence together.
Yeah, I mean, Pelosi was asked about generally this whole fight, turnover of leadership directly, about whether she thinks there should be new ranking members, new people in leadership. And she said some races, which for her, I think is that, pretty good. Like people were reading that as, a kind of,
Yeah.
giving her blessing for some turnover here.
Well, we'll see if it
Yeah,
extends to her own turnover
right.
at some point in this, or if she's just going to be shadow speaker forever,
Yeah,
shadow Democratic leader.
she's helping in Northern California, Congressman Jared Huffman, kind of giving him a boost potentially for his bid for the Natural Resources Committee, which is the final one here where there's a contest.
Right, where Raul
Grijalva is stepping in.
Grijalva, he stepped down. He's actually
Yeah.
leaving Congress next term, and he endorsed Melanie Stansbury as a younger, only been in Congress since 2021, younger member who's running against Huffman for that spot. So it's interesting. I
Yeah.
mean, for a long time, uh, there was so much of a bottleneck in the Democratic Party leadership that really talented members who wanted to, rise through the ranks in the House ended up bailing. I mean, the biggest example is Chris Van Hollen, who was kind of groomed to be the next speaker after Nancy Pelosi, but because she just wouldn't leave when a Senate seat opened up, Van Hollen took it,
Right.
and so there was this kind of vacuum after the top level. So it's good to see the ability potentially for some new blood
Yeah.
in the party. Now we can talk also about sort of the new blood that's looking dangerously to the past. This week, I wrote a story based on a memo that was produced by a guy named Seth London, who is kind of a donor advisor to a lot of the Democratic Party's top fundraising sources. He wrote this memo to discouraged Democrats, I believe was the people he was writing to. And it basically called for the restoration of the DLC. So the DLC is the Democratic Leadership Council. In 1984, after the 49 state landslide for Ronald Reagan, there was this belief that Democrats had lost the ability to win back a national majority in the country. They still had the House at that point, by the way, which they had held for 30 years prior. But it was really a belief that that Reaganism had utterly destroyed the ability for Democrats to compete. And so, what was the answer to that? Well, the answer was to go radically to the center. It was really a bunch of Southern Democrats who were aligning with the kind of right to work mentality in their states It was very much a pull against the union movement and a belief in free market politics, neoliberalism, free trade, intervention in foreign affairs, etc. And London kind of tries to have it both ways. In this memo, he says, "Well, we just want to take the organizational model of the DLC by having, the DLC was basically an elected official organization where elected officials were the leaders of the organization." And he's like, "Well, yeah, we just want to do that." But if you read the memo, which I did post at prospect.org, you see that what he's really after is the same kind of centrist politics, anti-identitarian, very much punching to the left kind of politics that he says is what's needed to regain the trust of the public, basically. It's an interesting memo. What's interesting is since then, I've heard not only from other donors who are readying their own memos, but also people who have already posted those publicly, people like Waleed Shahid and others who have already talked about, well, actually, here's what we have to do. It's a very different perspective. You actually wrote something a couple of weeks ago that cuts against this because one thing that London writes in the memo. By the way, all these stories are in the chat along the side here if you're watching on YouTube. One of the things that London writes about is that we should, listen to the people who won with, in the areas where we have struggled to compete and who outperformed the national ticket. And you wrote a piece about how, well, actually, if you listen to those people who outperformed the national ticket, you'd be listening to a lot of economic populists.
Yeah. I mean, I think it dovetails with this. I mean, it's fun. It's interesting based on what you said. It sounds like London's idea, or why he's calling back to the DLC to recreate the institution, is mainly like some vehicle with a lot of big donors, because that was also the case for the DLC. I mean, a lot of their
Yeah.
consultants were working for, Amazon
Well,
and
look, and
United
and
Airlines. Yeah.
you got to look at who Seth London is. He
Right.
worked for two venture capitalists. He worked for Bradley Tusk Ventures, which Tusk was Michael Bloomberg's campaign manager in 2009. He then works for a lobbying organization for startups, and the one, it's hard to find exactly what they did in terms of who their clients were, but the one that we could find was for a national campaign for the airline industry. So yeah,
Right.
this is
Oh yeah. Well, then
a
literally
big,
following in the legacy of DLC then. Yeah. Yeah.
right. Yeah, this is a big money effort to put big money at the heart of politics once again, and I feel like that's what a lot of people have been railing against, and what they see in the Democratic Party that disappoints them, not something to emulate.
Yeah. I mean, so okay, to as a segue into my piece about this, I actually do think this is following very directly the same pattern that played out with the DLC. There's a great book out called Left Adrift by this historian Timothy Schenck, um, and
Mm-hmm.
I won't go into too much detail. It's a great book though. I highly recommend. It's about these two political strategists and their kind of differing views about how to take Democrats out of the wilderness in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, basically their political careers, Doug Schoen and Stan Greenberg. And they both were, they both worked at different times with the Bill Clinton team in the 90s. And,
Right.
Doug Schoen was really the true id of like the DLC. He was a DLC creature. His approach was more that Democrats had to essentially be more Republican than the Republicans because the playing field was just inherently shifted to the right. Stan Greenberg wanted Democrats to run more as economic populists and have to tune that up over some of their cultural social stances that maybe just were out of step with the public at that time, right?
Right.
And his frustration that comes through in that book is that Clinton would always actually, for the most part, generally campaign as an economic populist. He just
Right.
wouldn't govern that way. And
Right.
I really see the same thing playing out now with this guy Seth London's memo, where he just wants to pick and choose a handful of issues where he wants the party to moderate and become more conservative even that are
Hmm.
kind of personally like he just feels comfortable with, right? Where if you look at the
Right.
actual candidates who are self-identified moderates, let's say they were part of the either Blue Dog or New Democrat caucus, which represent a kind of just a more conservative flank of the party. They won their races in frontline districts across the country by just as much by running on economic populist issues, trust busting, in industrial policy, actually selling a lot of the Biden administration's achievements and policy goals better than the national ticket could with Harris and Walz. A couple of the big names here are just a handful. There's Marie Gluskamp Perez in Washington, who won a very Trump leaning district, rural Washington. Um, and I mean, there's people talk about Jared Golden too in Maine. He's one name. There was Rebecca Cook in Wisconsin, who far overperformed how Democrats did nationally. She came up just short
Hmm.
in that race. There's uh, Congresswoman Delaney now, who's coming into office in Virginia. And
Yeah,
even,
she strongly
yeah,
defended Lena Khan. There
right,
was Sharice Davids, who
Davids, yeah,
was
yeah,
almost the head of the New Democrats, who in the last week of the campaign ran on improving and strengthening Robinson-Patman Act enforcement. So you see these issues that are really dedicated to, you know, speaking to people where they live in the pocketbook. Um, that's what carried Democrats through those various races. And if you look by contrast, London mentions Welcome Pack, which is this
right,
very much explicitly centrist pack that helps centrist candidates, and they help fund 10 candidates in 2024, and 8 of them lost. So
right. That's the flip
the
side of this.
idea,
Yeah,
yeah, the idea that there's this very clear demarcation that if you are a centrist, if you're a moderate, you win, and if you are not a
right.
moderate, a sanctioned moderate, you lose. A, it doesn't look at the issues involved, and B, it's not necessarily clear that that's even the case. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more discussion of this split, in the post-election period in terms of where everyone's going to go. But what's clear to me is that what London's calling for, this kind of party within a party, this factionalism that will play out in the midterms and will play out especially in the 2028 presidential race. I think that's where the party is destined, I think, to go. One thing that's interesting, though, is that the race for Democratic National Committee chair is not really picking up that tendency. DNC chair is not really a policy position. It is an organizing role. It is a party building role. And from everything I've heard and talking to members of the DNC, it's really going to come down to Ken Martin, who is the current chair of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, and Ben Wickler, who is the chair of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin. And neither of those people would be. I mean, I doubt they would be on Seth London's list, but they certainly are not coming at this from a perspective of here are the groups that we have to jettison. Here are the issues that we have to downplay, et cetera. It's about here's how the party has to invest to grow all over the country. That's what Martin and Wickler are really talking about. And so if anything's positive that's coming out of this, I think it's that.
Well, I'm feeling some Rahm Emanuel erasure here. Yeah, you're not even gonna mention his name. The new corruption reformer, Rahm Emanuel.
New
He,
anti-corruption reformer Rahm Emanuel. There was an
he
absolutely
bailed out the banks.
stunning,
That was a problem. The Iraq War was a huge issue.
what
Don't
a
ask me my
stunning
record
clip.
on that.
What a stunning clip. It was on CNN,
Yeah.
and he unprompted, I believe, talks about how nobody was held accountable for the Iraq War and nobody was held accountable for the global financial crisis when he was chief of staff right after both of those things happened, and his
Yeah.
administration didn't hold any of those people accountable.
But by the way, this is like a total rebuke to the Seth London faction too, because Rahm Emanuel's just putting he's putting his finger to the wind here. That's what's clear. And
Right.
what's he doing? He's, he's railing against the kind of old guard leadership, and especially, the bailing out the banks part, I think is particularly notable.
Right. I mean,
Um,
you saw this in the campaign a little bit when, it would always irk me when Kamala Harris started talking about how she took on the big banks. But what she knew,
right.
like the insight there was it's good politics to talk about going after the big banks, right? So it's a similar kind of takeaway there that Rahm is a snake, but he's going toward where the oxygen is in the Democratic Party and in the country. And maybe alongside that, we can talk about this kind of cultural event that happened this week that's getting a ton of attention. We've written about it at the Prospect as well, which is the
Yeah.
murder, the apparently targeted assassination of Brian Thompson, who's the CEO of United Healthcare. United Healthcare is the healthcare division of United Health Group, which is the umbrella organization that has much its tentacles in a whole bunch of the health system. But healthcare, the United Healthcare is really the insurance arm of that, the insurance company. And this guy was CEO of it. He was, I mean, there's video of him being shot in the back in a target, what looks like a targeted assassination. The shell casings had the words deny, defend, and depose on them, which is a reference to how the insurance company tries to get out of covering people. And this has engendered a ton of fury online, basically, all but saying this is a good thing, essentially. A ton of memes, ton of jokes that really show this tremendous amount of anger in the country. In this case, over healthcare and health insurance, but it could have been applied to other issues if it was a different CEO. And I think there's a line. I think it was Louis Brandeis who once said, if you want the people to have respect for the law, then the law has to be respectable. And what he's saying there is that, if we have runaway inequality, if we have corporate domination over American life, that what you're giving to people is no recourse except for unrest, except for violence. And I think that
Vigilantism. Yeah.
and and I think that the anger here that we're seeing in the country over this is a reflection of that powerlessness and of the fact that in a rigged system, the only way that people think to respond, and not everyone is going to go out and shoot CEOs, but it creates the conditions for that to happen. And more important, it creates the conditions for people to not care if that happens, or at least to say that publicly. And we don't want we don't want a country that's kind of in a third world position where, these kinds of things happen routinely. We don't want vigilantism to run rampant in America. It would be bad for everybody. However, if we don't change the rules that rig the system against ordinary people, you push people into that position. And so I think that it's a very dangerous moment and it's a revealing moment. What do you think about it?
Yeah. I think, no, yeah, no, I don't think anyone wants a situation where people resort to vigilantism. I don't really know that I have that much more to add than what's in Mo's piece, but I'll summarize, I think, sort of the premise because it was also
You
my,
mean Mo Tkacik, who wrote
yes.
the Manhattan Medicare murder mystery,
Yeah.
which we'll get a link up in the chat.
So because I had the immediate, reaction that is sort of how her piece starts, which is, you know, when the news broke about this targeted assassination of CEO of United Health, um, and there was all kinds of speculations about who the killer was. The video looked like some kind of, hit job, but that might
Yeah,
not totally be the case now. If you're looking for a suspect, it's really hard because there are millions of people, like almost a
right.
third of insured people who potentially have a motive because uh,
Yeah,
United has one of the highest claim denial rates, and there's just all kinds of flaws across their different, lines of
yeah.
business
I
that
mean,
make it
in
extremely
Maureen's
and
piece,
yeah,
she the first person she reached out to was an 88-year-old woman who was repeatedly getting denied on coverage from United Health, from a Medicare Advantage plan that
advantage.
she has
Yeah,
with them. And the first words out of her mouth was, "I didn't do it."
yeah,
Like this woman who's not very ambulatory, this 88-year-old woman, felt the need to give an alibi to Mo over this killing.
yeah. No, I mean that's exactly where I was going because I think it just, I think that's what kind of speaks to the overall like public outrage about this. I'll say also though part of my reaction, and I'm just going this route because we don't know all the details. There's this giant, manhunt, but I because again, I think this again it speaks to the institutional failure of a company like United. They have so many different lines of business that my first thought wasn't actually also just the insurance denial claims. They just had a huge ransomware attack
Yeah,
situation where they actually had to negotiate with some pretty, like criminal foreign hacker groups. And Mo Tazek also wrote a whole piece about that. So I thought my mind went there immediately. They'd had this, exchange with an actual criminal, enterprise
right.
group. They screw over pharmacists all the time. They have a PBM arm as well. I mean, there's so many there's so many people with
I'm,
potential motives.
I'm going to read you a quote, and our friend Matt Stoller put this up at his website. It's from John Sherman, the namesake of the Sherman Act, and it's from 1890. And here's the quote. Uh, you must heed their appeal or be ready for the socialist, the communist, and the nihilist. Society is now disturbed by forces never felt before. The popular mind is agitated with problems that may disturb social order, and among them all, none is more threatening than the inequality of condition, of wealth, and opportunity that has grown within a single generation out of the concentration of capital into vast combinations to control production and trade and to break down competition. I mean, in other words, what he's saying there is that the antitrust laws actually are necessary to maintain and restore order in the population, to eliminate this kind of threat of people taking the law into their own hands.
Yeah, it's a remarkable quote. I've seen a lot of comparisons to the Gilded Age era from this assassination, where I believe in the 1890s there was also a very high profile, prominent killing.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
well, there was Henry
Um,
Clay Frick was
uh-huh.
shot. He was responsible for the Homestead Strike, one of those brutal strike actions of that period, and he was shot by somebody. William McKinley was shot by an anarchist and killed, bringing Teddy Roosevelt into the White House. So yeah, that was a time of political assassination, and a lot of it was about anger with the system as it was. And so, none of this is to say that I condone it or that I'm warning CEOs. But the dominant conversation about
Yeah.
this in the mainstream media is about what protective services are CEOs going to get? What gated communities are they going to lock themselves into? What security guards are they going to have shuttling around? Are
Yeah.
they going to take their names off publicly off of websites so people can't track them. I think that's probably the wrong way to look at this, that this is a larger problem of corporations having such a dominance over American life that it is breeding a type of social unrest.
Yeah, there was just a report today that private security companies, their phones are like flying off the hook from, companies that are now calling them for protected
Yeah.
details.
So now there's a
Yeah,
stock trade in it, right? There's
right.
there's like
There's
the
stocks going
UHC
up.
trade. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, all right. Well, you know, what else shall we get to here? One thing that, speaking of corporate influence, that I wrote about earlier this week was in Michigan. So there are two states that had Democratic trifectas and lost them in the elections. One is Minnesota, where they had a narrow majority in the House and they lost it, and
Did a lot of good stuff, right? I mean, we
did a
covered that.
lot of
They
good
had a
stuff
big
early.
session. Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is that in these final moments where they only have the majority for another couple weeks, Tim Walz has not called a special session to do any kind of last minute thing while there's still a majority. He has not done that. He hasn't called the last. There is no lame duck session there
Hmm.
right now. In Michigan, there is a lame duck session because it's the normal course of business. Michigan had a trifecta, lost it by, I believe, one vote in the Michigan House. And what they're doing with their final weeks in office is giving away a bunch of corporate money and economic development subsidies. It could reach as high as $11 billion over the course of the 2023 and 2024 session when Democrats were in power for the first time in 40 years. That's $1,000 for every man, woman, and child in the state of Michigan. And it runs all the way from $2 billion in film production credits to a very large subsidy tax credit, basically a tax abatement on data centers. So that money goes to the richest tech companies in the world.
Right, which create also no jobs. This is always the thing about the data
Almost none.
getting subsidies. It's just the biggest racket because they always say the money's for jobs for people. It's a data center does not have employees a
Yeah,
handful. Yeah,
30 jobs, or like
yeah,
the construction jobs, and that's
yeah.
about it. So yeah, and there are other bills meanwhile on housing and on environmental cleanup, and bills that have that Democrats ran on 2 years ago that are basically being told we've run out of time. And I talked to not just advocates but members. I talked to two members of the Michigan House who said that they're deeply frustrated about this, that it looks like the Speaker of the Michigan House is kind of checked out, and that this is a real kind of crisis, that they're spending the waning moments of having this power basically giving away a bunch of money to corporate interests.
Right, doing a fire sale. Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
have, I mean, and Whitmer's has had involvement in this, right? She's been
Well, her biggest priority in the lame duck is topping off an economic development uh, fund. It's called SOAR, and I forget what the acronym stands for, but that's what it's called. That's her major priority in the lame duck session, is to do that. I had one person tell me that she's basically done the bidding of corporations throughout the 2 year term. Strategic Outreach Attraction Reserve. Thank you to our producer and behind the scenes for telling me what that stood for. So yeah, I mean, she's been big into economic development subsidies,
right.
and it's probably something people should know, considering that Whitmer is going to be, a somewhat prominent potential candidate in the 2028 election.
Yeah. No, I mean, it fits into the whole states issue that we just rolled out as well. Some of the
Yeah,
problems.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And, I mean, we have seen here and there across the country, Democratic governors saying we're going to resist the Trump administration. We're going to get our ducks in a row to fund lawsuits against things that are happening. And Whitmer's kind of taken a different approach. He said, I'll try to find common ground and areas that we can work together with the president. This split, actually, we see on a whole bunch of different levels in Washington as well. Are Democrats supposed to, blanket block everything, resist everything that's happening out of the Trump administration, or should they collaborate in some ways? We're
Eric
seeing this with
Adams.
this Eric Adams, but also, like, for example, this Doge situation with the Department of Government
Right.
Efficiency. And, they have a caucus in the House. And, for example, Ro Khanna joined that caucus and said, I'm willing to work with anyone to get, better results for the American people. And he's talking about cutting the Pentagon budget, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's like a question of approach. How do Democrats approach this? Obviously, the first Trump term, it was more on the resistance side of things, and that ended up winning the House in a large mandate in 2018. This time around, there seems to be more playing footsie.
Well, I think that there is, because it wasn't just Ro Khanna has probably been the most active in saying I'll actually, help with the Doge project. But Bernie also put out a statement that,
Mm-hmm.
he dares the administration to cut down on some, redundancy and excess funding by going, cutting the military budget, and trying to get DOD to clean up its act, maybe pass an audit.
I
So
mean, yeah, there's a few ways of looking at it, right? I mean, the one way is we're going to talk about these things that Republicans obviously aren't going to do,
right,
and we're going to hold them accountable when they don't do it. And I think that's what Bernie's after, and maybe to an extent
yeah,
that's what Ro Khanna's after. The other way to do it is to say for your policies, and that's a whole. I don't see Bernie doing that. I don't see him going in and voting for more border funding and or some strip of quote unquote wasteful spending to pay for that. I don't see that happening. So I think using a
right,
rhetorical technique that says I will take these people at their word and see if they're willing to actually make advances for people and then hold them accountable if they don't. I don't see a problem with that at all. In fact, my next piece in the print issue is essentially going to be, can we figure out how to do Doge's work correctly?
right. No, no, I think they're different battle lines here. I think the Bernie strategy is almost a little tongue in cheek. He also,
That's right.
lightly, he said this about capping credit card interest rates too,
Yeah,
which that strategy is basically daring the Trump administration to do any of the popular stuff that they promised
to
and floated,
live up to their word. Yeah, to
right?
live up to their
Yeah,
promises. Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and I don't see a problem with that. So it's just it's a matter of is this rhetoric or reality? And I think in a lot of ways it's rhetoric, and it's probably pretty good rhetoric if
right.
it pays off. All right, we got about 5 minutes left. I know there was one thing that you mentioned that you wanted to bring in, and I don't know if your roommate's around,
I
but he
know.
factors very heavily in this.
I know. I
And
tried. Yeah.
yeah, he's
I
not around.
tried getting
Um,
the special correspondent to come on here.
well, yeah, because
Yeah.
he actually attracted a comment from apparently our shadow president Elon Musk about this, and that has to do with so Elon said we should delete the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And it was based on a series of comments that Mark Andreessen, a venture capitalist, made on Joe Rogan's show. We've invited Mark on. He hasn't said anything yet.
No
Maybe
show.
someday he'll
He's
maybe
scared.
someday he'll come on the roundup. But uh,
You think
you
we'd
know
be a little bit
he
tougher than Joe Rogan was with him?
maybe slight. We wouldn't just like listen to what he's saying and go, really,
Yeah.
really, really. Um, so what was he saying? He was talking about quote unquote debanking and how the CFPB was getting people kicked out of their bank accounts for the mere their ideological views or what business they were interested in or whatever. And there are a lot of things wrong with this, first of all. And we wrote about this actually. Ryan Cooper had a piece this week about, I think it ran last Friday on Black Friday. Um, uh, there are a lot of things wrong with this, right? First of all, CFPB has been doing the exact opposite of this, that they have been trying to protect
Yeah.
people who were kicked out of bank accounts for discriminatory reasons. And actually, they're in a fight against the Chamber of Commerce right now over that very issue.
In the banking sector, the whole gambit. And
And the second part of this is that Mark Andreessen himself funds companies as a venture capitalist who are under investigation from the CFPB.
yeah.
Right. So it's very transparent what he is interested in here.
So yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad we're talking about this because to me, this whole fight is going to be kind of a harbinger of what's to come for a lot of the next 4 years because it really hits right at the heart of the problem or the difficulty of the Trump coalition, right, that they've put together. Running as a populist, but with all these, billionaire kind of overlords who are funding it and boosting his candidacy and how that's going to actually influence the way he governs. Mark Andreessen was a big Trump backer on the race. And he's conflating on this whole spiel he went on Joe Rogan, two different things. I'm saying conflating like I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, but it's a very
It's a
it was
deliberate
very
one.
purposeful. Yeah. Um, there's kicking crypto groups out of the banking system for like doing money laundering, right? And
Right.
then there's this phenomena of debanking where people of all different political persuasions have sometimes been cut out of financial services, banks, or PayPal and fintech for various political views and things that are not actually illegal. The CFPB has tried to actually guard against this debanking tactic and has gone to court. They get blocked in court by Trump judges in the
Right.
Texas Fifth Circuit, right? So it's even more the complete, opposite of what Mark Andreessen is claiming, and this turned into sort of this whole fight this past week, and the CFPB actually had another rule that came down this week to try to close data broker loopholes for how people
Yeah.
transact people's data.
Well,
In
and they
that
also,
rule, yeah,
yeah,
in that
no, go
rule, they
ahead.
mentioned debanking as actually one potential, like ill effect of people's information
Right, because
getting
if your
exchanged.
data can be
Yeah,
acquired, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And they also shut down a credit repair service that was totally ripping off the American people and brought back $2 billion in junk fees that will be
right.
distributed back to people who are ripped off. So that's what needs to be deleted, right? Is the one of the few organizations within the government that's looking out for consumers.
That's really
All right. Well,
underfunded and delivers a lot back. Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. All right. We are out of time. Luke Goldstein, thank you very much for being here on the Roundup. We are here every single week. You can check us out. We post this at prospect.org, so tell your friends. And we, are running an end of the year campaign. So if you have a little bit of extra dollars, want to make a tax deductible donation to the Prospect so we continue this work, it is at prospect.org/donate. Thank you very much for being here, and we will be back next week.
Yep.
So long.